I am going to show you the workflow that I demonstrated in class this past Monday, January 27th, where we went into the studio and shot some tests for a demo on rim lighting with Ethan. So for those who weren't able to follow along or were absent, here's the basic workflow that I use. So after importing the digital images off the SD card into Lightroom, I then went through and quickly looked at the images one by one using my right arrow key and opening the image in the loop view mode, which you can access like that. And using the right arrow key, I'm just able to go through, and what I did in this case is I settled on images that I thought had something interesting in them and also the best possible rim lighting. And I hit the number 4 in order to star rate them. And I just used 4 as a general example. And as I went through, I just hit number 4 on images that I thought were interesting. So I'm just demonstrating that even though I've already pre-selected the images I want to use here. Just showing you how I do it. I'm hitting the arrow key to the right, and this one's a good 4, etc. So I've already chosen several of them. And now I want to show you when you have a selection of images that you've either given a star rating to or a color rating in this case. Like I could easily hit a number 6, 7, 8, or 9 to give them a color rating. That's another way of just calling attention to images by giving the thumbnails a color. In any event, if I want to select all of the images that I've given a rating or a color flag to, all I need to do is turn on the filters here, and either I can select images by their rating, or I can select images by their color and their rating, or any combination thereof. So here I've chosen just any images that I selected and marked as red, and I'll turn that off. And here I'm hitting 4 stars to just, whoops, sorry about that. Here I hit 4 stars here just to select all the images that I have pre-selected with 4 stars. So that's how that works. Now, I want to go in and just take a look at the images one by one and just kind of pre-think what I want to do to them. So one of the things that I did in class was I turned all of these black and white because I just want to show the rim lighting as simply as possible, and I love the look of the black and white rim lighting, similarly to the samples I gave you in the PDF included in class. So I'm going to select all of these using Command A, or I could go up in here and do Select All, same thing. And I'm going to go to Develop Module. And here, under the Basic panel, I choose black and white. And instantly, all of the images turn black and white. I'm going to just enlarge this so you can see the thumbnails are all black and white. Or I can also go back to Library and click the thumbnails that way in the grid, and you'll see the same thing. So anyway, let's go back to the Develop panel. So here they are in black and white, and I definitely see ways of improving these slightly in Lightroom in order to consider them fairly finished. This one's rim lit, but it could be brighter. So in this case, I can just assign a little bit more brightness to it. And when I do that, I'm also going to enlarge the image so that I can really see the content and the pixels within it. And what I want to do is make sure that I don't have any blown out pixels that would be pure white. And this one's pretty good, but as I move these sliders, I have to watch out that I don't clip the images. Another way to do that is to look at the histogram, and if I over brighten the image, you'll see the histogram creep to the right, and as soon as it hits the edge of that histogram window, it starts to show me that any pixels over here are going to be too bright to print. It also is just unpleasant looking, so naturally I want to go down to the point where I have edge lighting, but I still have mood, and that's what I'm trying to achieve with edge lighting. Another thing that I consistently do is I will lower the highlights slightly, and that helps me preserve detail in the highlight areas, whether it's a skin tone or whether it's clouds or anything that tends to be easily overly brightened during photography. So notice that these are still all selected, and if I'm going to make any other moves, I should look at them individually. I want to also point out that if you're trying to make moves on all of the things that you select, you have to make sure that auto sync is set to on. If yours is set there, it will not make the same changes to all of the images selected. So that's an important thing I almost forgot to bring up. Now, the fact that I selected and augmented all of them at the same time, I now want to go through and see how they are as individual images. Another thing I would do on this one here is to get rid of some of the excess lighting here, because mainly we're talking about the rim lighting on this side. I can lower the shadow tones, I can lower black, or I can even paint in black areas with the brush, as I'll show you in a few minutes. But first I want to just get these images balanced the best way they can be and do some cropping as well. So first I'm just going to go for balance. I want to enlarge this one here of Kelly and make sure that I don't have any blown highlights on her skin. Really, really nice photograph of Kelly. I'm going to bring down contrast slightly. Even though I like the high contrast look of edge lighting, I just want to bring it down a little bit, and I want to also make sure that the highlights are well within the printable range, which they are here. And there's nothing that looks blown out here. Her hands are beautifully lit, and there's a nice edge lighting on those too. And then I'm going to go through this one, take a look at Kelly here, and this one here looks like it's getting a little bit blown out, so I want to enlarge that even more. I'm going to click 2:1 here, and yes, I can see that there's very little detail in the pixels here. So I want to be sure to protect those, and I'm going to lower the contrast a little bit, and I'm going to lower the highlight slider. And just a little bit is all you need till you can see some tone there. And you might notice here also, when I did that, the histogram also backed off the edge there. So that's a good sign. No blown pixels, looks really good. I'm going to use Command- and Command+ to zoom in and zoom out. And I can see some improvements I want to make on this image here. So I'm first going to go through and just look at these. Now here's one of Max that's really great. You know, it really shows off his facial features and his neck, and it's just a really beautiful capture of edge lighting. So this one here, I can probably just leave pretty much as is. I'm just going to check my highlights, check my shadows. In the end, really, we want to make sure that we have a good dense black here for printing. And I can see some things that I might augment a little bit with this adjustment brush. But first, let's finish looking at these individually. Here's the man himself, Ethan. And this one looks like we've got some blown highlights here, but I want to check, yeah, we're pretty close to the edge. So I do want to check this one here and lower the highlights just a bit. That's great. All right, man. Nice highlight on the ear here. Whoever thought of using a fill card there was right on the money. Okay, I'm going to just check this last one here. Wonderful. I love the highlights in the eyes. I'm just going to come down and cool this down a little bit. Might be a little overly brightened, and zoom in here a little bit more with my Command+ and use my key here. Okay, that's not looking too bad. I'm going to lower the contrast a little bit and probably come in just a little bit tighter on the highlights. Again, you don't want to use the highlight slider so much that they turn gray like this. You want to keep the highlights open but not blown out. Refer to the histogram if you see this happening. Keep in mind though, you might see a little bit of action in the histogram here, and sometimes all that is the catch light. You know, it's or even just a button or something like that that's got a highlight on it. That'll show up as a little dash at the bottom of the histogram. When you see a histogram climb up like this with white, that means that a lot of pixels are involved. Because keep in mind that this here is the highlights of the tonal range, this here is the shadows of the tonal range. The height of anything in your histogram just simply is a measure of how many pixels in the image have that tone. Another thing you can do if you want to check for blown highlights is click on this highlight warning, and I'll just give you an example of how that works. If you click on the highlight warning, it's got a little box around it, and then if the highlights were blown, they'll show up with a special highlight tone that gives them away. But that's not happening in these pictures, so we're not going to really see that work. I'm going to come back down and look at this image overall. Looks like it's got some great edge lighting. Increase the contrast just a hair, and we're good to go. I always come and check this. All right, so each of these has a slightly different look, and this one here actually I think I'm going to raise the shadows just a bit and the contrast just a bit. So I'm going to look at all of these now, and I'm just going to select all of them by the Shift click select, and I am going to give these all the red color, the red marker. So I'm going to hit the number 6, and that'll turn them all red. And the only reason I'm doing that is because if I'm not doing a filter, and I'm going to look at all of the images that I shot using the grid with the letter G, you can see how helpful it can be to have not just a star rating, which shows up down here, but it may not always show up to have a star rating here, because that has to do with a Lightroom setting that allows you to see star ratings in these thumbnails in the grid. And this is why using a color can be much, much more helpful than just giving you a quick glance to bring you back to certain images you want to talk about. All right, I'm going to go back to filtering for red, and there we are, the images again. Now, the last thing I showed before we ended class was I showed some work on specific images, and here's a good example of one. So one of the things that we can do to improve this, if we want to bring out some of these highlights here as a balance to this side of the frame, because remember, I'm always concerned with how you compose, not just what it is you photograph and how technically accurate you're doing it. I'm much more interested in the overall image. Now, we can't really see the true edges of this image in this part of the workspace, because what I need to do is go to the preferences in Lightroom, look at the interface, and get my screen color back to dark gray. No, that didn't seem to help, so I won't really demo that now. But there is a way of making this have a gray background instead of a black background. Let me try one more thing. I don't give up too easily. Okay, it is in fact in Lightroom Classic Preferences. Main window fill color. Go to a dark gray. That's what I'm looking for. Okay. Yours probably already is dark gray, because I'm sure I messed with that at some point and turned it black. There we go. Now we can see the composition as well, which I find really helpful. So once again, if I want to bring these highlights out, I grab what's called the adjustment brush. Now that brush, even if you have all of these collapsed, you'll always see these local adjustments. And keep in mind that in Lightroom, everything here is a global adjustment, meaning it's going to adjust the entire image at once when you use these sliders or anything down here. Whereas the tools here are considered local adjustments because they work on localized areas of your image. So I'm going to click the adjustment brush, and I'm going to always click the effect to neutral. By double clicking the word effect, in fact this works on any of these parts of Lightroom. If you open up any of these panels and you want a neutral, set to neutral all these sliders, you just double click the word associated with those sliders. But back here. So now that this has been set to 0, what I decide is, okay, I think, what do I want to do? Well, if I want to bring out the highlights here, then what I want to do is probably preset maybe my highlights like this, and maybe my whites. And then when I apply the brush, I should see these changes. And here I can change the brush size, as you see interactively right over there. And I can change whether I want it feathered or not feathered. In this case, that would be fine. I can also change the brush's strength or flow and density to create more and more of an effect each time I brush. So I'm going to brush here along the back side of the hair and down on the neck. I like that highlight, kind of a nice touch. And if I wanted to, I can also add a little bit of highlight here to the hand. Now here I'd probably want to reduce my brush, so I can either keep going over here and reducing it or enlarging it, or I can use the bracket keys next to the letter P to enlarge my brush. So left bracket makes the brush smaller and right bracket makes it larger. Shift left bracket makes the brush less feathered, and right shift bracket makes the brush more feathered. So that's just a quicker way of getting to that without having to mouse over here. I'm going to make the brush smaller, come in here really tight with the brush, and I'm going to add a little bit more flow. And there we go. So once I click down and use a brush, it doesn't really matter where I position it the first time. All these dots do is they show that there is a brush active. When the dot is not lit up and not black, that shows a brush that I used before. In this case, I used it in order to take out this piece of reflective material, or it might have been a softbox. I'm going to go back and show you that again. So if you hover over the brush's starting point, you can see where the brush has been used. That's called an overlay mask. If you want to see that overlay mask all the time, you simply turn it on here, or hit the letter O for overlay. I also like to show the edit pins set to auto, because that means that when I'm hovering over the image, I can see the pin that represents this particular edit adjustment brush. And when I hover over here, that pin goes away so that I can see my image without that little circle sticking to it. Now, I promised you that I'd show you how to take that out. And the way you do that is you actually create an adjustment brush setting that is purely about turning something completely black. I'm going to come back and do that at the end. I'm going to go to the next image, take a look at this. This one really I don't think I need to do any local adjustments on. And this one of Kelly, that's pretty perfect. Maybe I'd make this a little bit quieter down here, take care of this little ripple. So I'm going to put this back to, whoops. I don't know what that's all about there. Okay. I want to just take that out, so I'm going to make my adjustment brush behave with negative exposure all the way, and basically it behaves like a black brush. All right, that's great. If I wanted to bring out her hair a little bit more, I could bring this up. If I simply do it by bringing the exposure up all the way, it's going to sometimes make black shapes like that, or gray shapes like that. So I don't want to go up too high in exposure. I'd rather boost highlights, because that confines the work of the brush to just the highlight areas of the photograph. So these things are very important, because exposures overall and highlights just affects highlights, shadows just affects shadows, pretty obviously, right? So I'm going to brush here a little bit, and if I overdo it, the neat thing about these adjustment brushes is if you overdo something with them, all you have to do is go to the erase mode that each brush has, and you do have to do some scrolling to see that. I'm going to close histogram here. And once I'm in the erase mode, the cursor for the brush shows a minus sign, and I can go and undo any areas that I brushed there. And that looks like this. If I show the overlay, right, the minus brush or the erase brush is taking away from wherever I brushed before. If you want to learn more about that, look up adjustment brush on YouTube. This one here is pretty wonderful. I could easily take away these extra little bits here, but I think I'll do that in cropping later. This just looks great. And this one of Ethan's good. It looks like it's got some extra brushing here. It looks like I'd done that before. I'm going to delete that so I can show it to you from scratch. And I'm going to come in here and boost the edges a little bit on this side of Ethan's head, especially his ear. And you can just follow along the contour and it'll pick up whatever existing lighting is there and make it even brighter. And the cool thing is that once I lay this brush down, and as you can see, I'm going to hover over this and you can see the red overlay. Once I lay that brush down, I can move these, and it just basically applies anything I'm doing here to the brush. So it's really, really easy to do some work, lay down a mask or lay down the overlay mask area, and then independently move the sliders and see how it affects it. Lastly, I've gotten this really wonderful photograph, just a great portrait. I'm going to just look at this and say, what do I need to do here? Well, I still think that maybe some global corrections are needed because this looks a little hot here. So I'm going to lower the contrast a bit, and I'm going to protect the highlights even a little bit more. There, that feels more balanced to me. Can't see anything else to do with this, so I will leave it alone. Now, I want to go through and recrop these images, and finally, I want to show you how to make a black brush, which I hinted on before, but I'm going to grab the adjustment brush, set it to minus exposure, full contrast, minus shadows, and I can actually save any preset that I want. Let's say, it's very likely I'm going to need a black brush in the future. I've already made one here, but all you have to do is go to Save Current Settings as a new preset, call it black brush, and now you know what it's going to do. I told you I'd already made one of these, so it says name in use, but if I hadn't made one before, that wouldn't be lit up. So now I have a black brush, and there's my black brush, and it's already got these settings that I like. Guarantee that whatever I touch down on with this brush is going to be pure black, and I just blacken that out. See if anyone else needs that. I think that this one needed it right here. Take out the little bits of the chair. That looks pretty good. There's a little highlight there I don't like. I'll take that out too. So there you go. The nice thing is, as I said in class, the more you know how to use post-production, there's no shame in it. Using post-production is another studio tool as far as I'm concerned, just as importantly as lighting, props, model, hair, makeup, anything like that. So use the power of Lightroom or Photoshop to do the kinds of things that would take a lot more time to do in camera or on set. And by knowing what you know in Lightroom or Photoshop, you can save a lot of time on set by letting go of details and problems that you can fix easily in post. Lastly, I just want to show some cropping here. This one looks great. The next one over here, I like the shape of this in its space, but I think it could come down a little more. I'm also not super fond of the ratio of 35mm all the time, so I like to go to the crop tool here, and I have already unopened this lock, which is what locks the aspect ratio. So when the lock is on, if I grab one of the corners to try to crop this image, it keeps the original 35mm aspect ratio, right? You know what aspect ratio is, I'm sure. If I open the lock, then I can freeform crop this however I want. And that feels like a better crop to me. I'm typically going to go to the 5:7 crop on a lot of my work because it just feels like a good ratio of height and width to me. Some people like 4:5 because that's a traditional ratio that's been used in photography since the very beginning. But I'm just going to go freeform here just so we can see how that works. I like that, and when I'm ready to accept that crop, I just hit done. Go to the next one. Same here. I feel like a little cropping is necessary. So, by the way, I don't have to even mouse up to the crop tool. I can hit the letter R. That goes to the crop tool. As you can see, if you hover over any tool, it's going to give you a tool tip and that tooltip will give you a key shortcut, which I really think is useful to learn. It saves a lot of time. Lower this, and again, I'm going to open up this lock so that I can crop this exactly the way I want. I like the way Lightroom gives you a very logical cropping method here, and then you can mouse inside your image and move it around that shape. I like this shape there. That looks about right to me. I'm going to hit my return key, which is the same as hitting done. Go in here. I love the crop of this one. Again, I'm not a real big fan of the height of 35mm verticals, so I am going to bring that down just a bit. This feels a little bit better in the frame to me. Hit return. Can't improve on that. It's just a great cropping of Max. This one here feels more like it should be a vertical to me, or a horizontal that's not centered. So I'm going to go for the latter, and I'm going to go in here and just move this till he's less in the center. The other thing that occurs to me is this would be a great square, as a few of these could be. But to get square, all you need to do is engage the crop tool and go in the custom menu to 1 by 1, and that's a guaranteed perfect square. And when I do square crops, I like there to be something off center, and that just makes it feel better to me than dead center. So I always like the subject to be looking into the frame rather than out of the frame, which feels like there should be something behind him. So that's about where I put it. And this 3x3 or 9 square grid is perfect because it allows you to use the quote rule of thirds, or the golden section, to help bring the eye to a comfortable place in your image. Lastly, go to this wonderful shot, and again, feeling like I could do a little bit better than this tall cropping here, so I'm just going to bring this down, and that's comfortable. Now, I will say that you can free crop all of your images, but it's probably a good idea to either settle on one of these existing aspect ratios or make your own by entering numbers. And then, for instance, you can say, well, I like this crop and I'd like this whole series of images to have that ratio. Then all you have to do is create one of them and then go in here and you can just say, I'm going to enter that as a custom. And you can put in your numbers there, and then you'd have a preset. So all of these are presets here, and you can return to them. These are ones I've set up before. And that way you've got a great way of cropping your images. So that's pretty much the end of this lesson. I can't think of anything else to show you except one thing, and that is I took the liberty of making some virtual copies of these so I could show you different croppings, and that's what this means here. So I'll give you an example of how that's done. Let me just find something by getting out of the crop tool. So here's the one of Ethan, for instance. So let's say I wanted to have a version that's square, and I wanted to have a version that's also a portrait mode or vertical. Then I can make a virtual copy, and as I explained in class, the control click or right click, if you're using a mouse, is a great way to get to a pop-up menu that gives you the ability to do anything that you can do to that particular thumbnail. In this case, it's called Create Virtual Copy. The quick key for virtual copy is Command' on the keyboard. And now I have a virtual copy. And virtual copies only live in the Lightroom catalog. They don't make independent files. They don't add another CR2 file. But they do give it the name Copy1. So you can tell when you're on the original because it says CR2 in this case, and you can tell when it's a virtual copy because it says copy and it's got a dog ear on the corner or a turned up corner. So keep in mind that virtual copies only live in the catalog, but the cool thing about them is you can do a color version, or you can make any kinds of changes you want to the image, and it's going to not affect the original. In fact, you can then export it, print it, do anything from a virtual copy. And virtual copies can be as many as you want per image. Now, when you make a virtual copy of an image, you're always going to see that it counts up how many copies you've made. So this is 1 of 2, and this is 2 of 2. And as many virtual copies as you have, you'll get different versions, and you'll get those counted up here. So I'm going to do another virtual copy from this one, Command apostrophe, and this one I'm going to make color, just so we can see how virtual copy can help you. I'm going to take both of these by shift selecting both of them, and you can see they're lit up. And now I'm going to go back to the crop tool, and because they're both selected and I have auto sync on, I can now grab this here. Whoops, I want to unlock that and make a vertical portrait mode out of it. And you can see how both of these immediately turned into verticals, and they're exactly identical. And now I can hit done, and that's it. So there's your virtual copies. And if you wanted to, you could stack the virtual copies by selecting them, holding down your control click, or you can go to right click if you have it, and you can go to stacking, group into stack. And that what it does is when you stack and unstack, it either opens the stack up, revealing all three, or it closes the stack and shows you that there are 3 things stacked. It even gives you a little icon of the amount of images in the stack. This one here has 2. I'm going to unstack that. There. All right, so that's the lesson, and thanks for watching.